Hey, I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today we're gonna make a shovel guitar. I had this crusty old shovel in my shed, and it's really rusty and pretty busted up, so I thought it'd be great for this. I clamped it down to the table on both ends so it wouldn't move around, and then I used a grinder to start tearing away some of the rust and cutting through some of the metal. The trick here is that I had to cut away enough metal so that I could make a neck for the guitar, but I didn't want to cut away so much that it would separate the metal piece from the wood. It turned out that the metal was actually a lot harder to cut through than I expected as well, so it took several tries using different types of cutting wheels and different grinders, but eventually I cut off the top and cleared out some of the nasty wood from the inside. I used a belt sander with 80 grit paper on it so it would really tear off wood pretty quickly. I made a few passes at this, trying to flatten out an area, checking it with the level, and then doing some more. And eventually I marked where the nut would need to be so that I knew how far the actual flat spot on the neck needed to go. There was a lot of testing and sanding and testing and sanding to try to get this thing as flat as possible. It still ended up not being perfect, but it was pretty close. I used a stripping disc and some flap disc to smooth out the metal in this area. This is where your hand would actually be if you were strumming the guitar. So I didn't want anything sharp and I didn't want too much rust here. I also used a sanding block to knock off the corners of the neck, just so they weren't so sharp. There was a lot of flex in where these pieces were connected because it was just with one nail. So I got them in the position that I wanted them to stay and drilled some holes through the metal into the wood on both sides of the shovel. I drove in some short wood screws into all these holes and it stiffened it up quite a bit. I started to try to clean off some of the rust and some of the cement that was on this thing, and it made a huge mess, and so I just kind of abandoned that and ran over it with a wire brush just to knock off any of the big loose pieces. I did go over the whole handle of the shovel with an orbital sander just to smooth it out and remove anything that might be rough on your hands. A couple inches back from where I'd marked the nut, I made a mark for the tuning peg. I turned the handle on its side and then marked the depth for where the tuning peg needed to sit and a line that I could cut out. On the bandsaw, I just chopped off the end and then made the cutout for the tuning peg to sit in and sanded it smooth. I drilled a hole big enough for the tuning peg and set it in place. It's got these two little nubs on the underside, so I hammered it from the back to make marks where those nubs go. And then I drilled them out just deep enough for it to sit in and hammered it into place. Alright, I got a little ahead of myself and I made a mistake, as you do when you're making a guitar from a shovel. When you put a string in this, the string actually has to come from the tuning peg up and land on a nut that's going to be right here. And that's going to level it out so it can run down the neck of the guitar. In this case, what I should have done is cut this in the opposite direction so that the tuning peg was lower, giving me that incline. I didn't do that, and right now it's a little bit too high to lay across that nut. So here's what I'm going to do to fix it. I'm going to drill a hole like this, and then I'm going to flip the tuning peg over so that the string is going to start down here, go up, land on the nut, and then run down the neck. I think it'll be fine. So I just unscrewed the tuning peg and knocked it out. It came out very easily. And then did the same layout process to put it in from the other direction. Once I had it tightened up, I knew exactly where it was going to sit. So from the side, I could mark where I wanted the hole to start and the angle that it needed to go at. I started the hole and then leaned the drill bit back so that it went in at the angle. I got that hole drilled. The nut is going to be right here, and you can see when I put this through, it lines right up with the tuning peg, right where the nut would be. So this is perfect. I wanted to find where the neck hit the shovel pan, so I used a straight edge and scratched a line. I also used the straight edge to find the center point. This told me where the hole needed to be for the string. I used a punch to mark that hole and then drilled it out with a stepped bit, but I didn't make the hole very big. I also needed to smooth out the hole so that the sharp metal didn't cut the guitar string, so I used a drill bit just to smooth out the edges. I didn't have a file small enough to fit in that hole. I drilled an even smaller hole a couple inches above that, and that's where the nut for the string is going to stop. I fed a string through just to test it out and make sure that there weren't any sharp edges running against the string. I used a utility knife to sharpen a pencil, making it flat on one side. This will help me draw a line right up against the bridge piece that I was using, which was an 1/8 inch piece of aluminum. I set it in place and drew those lines, and then used a small hacksaw to cut out that area. I was trying to be really careful not to make it too big, because if it's too big, the aluminum would not stay in place. I did a fair amount of fitting, both with a utility knife and a chisel to get the bottom of it flat. I wanted the bottom of the aluminum to sit flat against the wood, so it was a nice snug fit. Once I had it fit in place, I used a Sharpie to make a just kind of rough shape around what I needed to cut away. The cool thing about aluminum is that you can work with it on most woodworking tools, so on the bandsaw I just cut out along the lines and ended up with a little piece to use for the bridge. Then I used a belt sander to round over all the edges and the corners that I had cut. To keep it in place, I added a little bit of CA glue and then used a rubber mallet to hammer in the nut into the slot. I used a file to make a groove for the string to sit in, but I was careful not to make it too deep and to make sure it wasn't sharp to where it would cut the string over time. For the pickup, I used an active EMG. I've got these on my other guitars, they're great. And the kit comes with everything you need and you don't have to do any soldering. You just plug everything in. I set the pickup in place in the pan to where I thought it should be and then marked right below it where 2 holes should be drilled. I used a really small drill bit to drill these holes to match the size of the screws that came with it. I also had to drill some holes for the tone and volume knobs and the audio input jack. The steel was pretty hard and I was using some really cheap stepped bits, so I actually had trouble making these holes the size that I wanted, but eventually I got them cut out. The instructions that come with the pickup are really simple and everything is very clearly marked. You just plug in some wires and it only takes a few seconds to get up and running. So once I had all that put together, I just put it into the holes that I had drilled and put on nuts to hold everything in place. I did drill one more hole and this was to feed the final wire up through to the pickup itself. The pickup gets held in place with screws coming in from the back with a spring on top of them. Even though this thing looks pretty rough, I thought it needed some knobs, so I added a couple of cheap knobs that I'd gotten from Radio Shack a long time ago, just to dress it up. I used some tung oil finish to cover all of the wood for this, and this is not a finish you would normally use on a guitar neck, but this is a shovel. It's just enough so that there's a nice finish to make it smooth and easy to move your finger on the fretboard. It's got some polyurethane in it, so it protects it a bit too. After that was fully cured, I put on another coat and then just strung it up like a normal guitar, even though it's a shovel. I tested it out through my amp just to make sure that the pickup was working and it worked fine the first time. Alright, it's all finished, so is it a good guitar? No, not really, it's a shovel, but also, I don't have any experience playing fretless instruments, so I don't really know how to do this. But my friend Rob does. I made this shovel guitar for Rob Scallon, and if you're not familiar with him, he's another YouTuber. He's a really fantastic guitar player. So if you want to see him play some real music with this thing, be sure to watch his video here. And while you're over there, watch a bunch of his other videos because he plays all types of music. He's ridiculously talented and a pretty funny guy too. So make sure you go watch his video, leave him a comment, and tell him that Bob sent you. I hope you like this one, and I'd love to know what you think about it. You can let me know in the comments down below or at my website, ILikeToMakeStuff.com. If you want to see what I'm working on in between these videos, you can check me out on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. I post there pretty often. I've got lots of other types of projects, some electronics and woodworking and all sorts of stuff, and you can check those out here. I love making these videos, and if you want to help me make more of them and make them better, Patreon is the best way to do that. Even $1 a month makes a pretty big difference. That's it for this one, guys. Don't forget to go check out Rob's channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.